All right guys, it's a new day and we're gonna keep working on this hood scoop here. So we've got our piece of aluminum here trimmed out to our basic parameters for this scoop. So like I said, this thing's gonna be flush at the back of the hood, and then it's gonna come forward, and right about here, it'd be about 3 inches. So it's gonna have a little bit of curve in it this way, not a ton, but I want it to kind of mimic the curve of the hood, just so it has more of a natural flow to it. So at this point, I'm gonna get this set up where I want it as far as the, spacing and getting it lined up on the hood here. And then I'm gonna draw out some lines and marks at some of the measurements that I need. And then at that point, we'll start shaping it. So yeah, the main thing I'm gonna be going for actually is when I measure that stuff is to get this set up where I want it, and I'm gonna measure the width of these points that I drew out and measure at what location on the scoop that those are going to be. That way I have some somewhat of an idea, obviously, when I start shaping at what point on this scoop I need those shapes. So we'll get to marking it. All right, we've got the scoop laid out here, and if you look at it, you can see it in the camera, there's just a bunch of lines that I drew out on here. And so basically, this is the front section here. So I got the width marked out like we had discussed as far as determining the shape of the scoop and the width that was gonna be needed there and that sort of thing. So got that all laid out, and then got the measurement from where we needed it at the widest point that was going to have the radius on it, with the flat section in the middle and the radius. Got that marked out on here at each point, and then I drew a line basically from the width that it's going to be flat in the middle to the back of the scoop here where it's just going to be flat, or that's the goal, that it's going to be flat. So we end up with this triangle shape on both sides, and that's essentially where we're going to need radius in this part. So it's going to go from flat to having a curve here and then wrapping around the front on both sides. And the whole part will have a subtle curve front to back to keep with the curve of the hood, make it to where it's not just a flat piece on a curved hood. It'll make it look better that way. So got that all marked out. So at this point, I'm going to start shaping. So I'm probably going to use initially, to start creating this shape, I'm going to use a 3-inch anvil, radius anvil on the English wheel to start creating this curve. And basically, I'm gonna use the rubber band and just wheel this into this point, kind of moving over every time. On this end, I'll move over a little bit. So I'll go down, move over a little bit, go down, move over a little bit, that sort of thing. But always come back to this point because I don't need that shape as much back here. So keep this very minimal. This will end up with a lot more curve in it, both sides. And we'll also work our way forward a little bit on that as well, because we need that radius to kind of transfer towards the front here. So that's all going to kind of change as we go forward. So we'll get to shaping and before too long, we'll have a nice hood scoop for this hood. All right, so you can see after some quick wheeling with the rubber band on the English wheel, we've got some initial shape in our scoop here. And obviously there's a lot more that's left to do, but you can kind of see how it's really taken shape in these areas. You know, we talked about at the one point we're gonna have a flat section in the middle, and then it's gonna radius off. Well, it's definitely doing that. We still have more to go as far as that curve. You know, same thing in the front, but this is getting our initial shape in place. So at this point, you know, I was running this over with the, I've got a 2-inch wide true radius lower anvil for the English wheel that is 3.25 on the radius. So yeah, I know I was going and have marked out for a 3-inch radius. So decided to use the 3.25 because I like to sneak up on the shape. I don't like to just try to hammer the shape right into something, try to, you know, go as far as you absolutely need to go right away, because there's a lot that goes into, especially a complex panel like this. Sometimes if you go too far too fast, you might miss something, a step that maybe you should have done or could have done that would have made the whole process a little bit easier. You know, and there's a number of things that could affect. So I'm going to do another round on the 3.25, tighten it up just a hair, see what it does, and, you know, go from there. There will be, you know, some shrinking, stretching, some stuff like that that'll end up having to go on, you know, with this. But like I said, for right now, I'm just trying to get some initial shape into this thing. Then we can start setting it on there and, you know, seeing what's going to be, you know, needing done. I left this long in the front. I've got about 2.5 inches of material in the front that's longer than what I think my scoop will have to be total. And that'll allow me to trim the right shape that I want in the front of this thing, as well as give me the extra material that I need to be able to put a little bit of a flanged lip or roll around the front of this thing. So I'm not 100% sure what that's going to look like yet, but left myself the extra material to be able to do so. So like I said, I'm going to stick this back on the English wheel and you know, start going from there, put some more shape in this thing, and we'll see this thing start taking a little more shape. All right, so you can see a pretty rough, obviously, shape here, kind of where we're headed with this thing. So it's got most of the curve that we need. We've got to tighten it up just a little bit as far as, you know, the curve over the top here. So I'm going to switch to the 2.5 inch radius anvil on the English wheel and keep rolling that a little bit. And yeah, once we get that kind of more in place as far as the curve that we need, make sure it's kind of fitting the width that we're looking for, then I'll kind of start planning out what we're going to do as far as getting this flange to tip out on the sides, how that's all going to meet up and fit. I'm going to put a little bit more radius. This is just totally flat here, which obviously that was the goal to start, but I do want to put a tiny bit of shape in the whole middle section of this, just to, you know, kind of keep with the curves of the hood and the rest of the truck and make sure it's just not too flat. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and switch anvils here. We'll keep rolling, get this to tighten up a little bit like I said, and then we'll figure out what we gotta do to tip these flanges out.
So obviously just got it sitting on here. There's a lot more left to do as far as adding the flanges out on the side, which is going to be pretty much tipping those into shape, that sort of thing. So what I'm going to do right now though is this whole front nose, obviously it's all pretty flat this direction. So what I'm going to do is actually do some thumbnail shrinking on the front of this to get all of this to kind of curve down a little bit, because I wanted this to come flat up here, but I also wanted it to kind of curve off as it comes to the end of the scoop, which will end up being about right here. So I'm going to do a little bit of thumbnail shrinking to get all this to kind of curve in a little bit, allow this thing to take a little bit different shape, and then once we get it to where it's looking a little bit closer to how we actually want it in the end, then we'll start doing any fine tuning on the shape here, and then we'll make sure and see what the shape has to be when we need to put some flanging out on the side here. So I've already got thumbnail dies set up in the Minimax machine over here, so we'll move over there and do some thumbnail shrinking back into here, and then we'll show you guys how the process works on that. So the thumbnail dies, it's a pretty crude process, I guess, in the way it works. The metal is going to look very distorted. It's going to basically, they call it a thumbnail shrinking die because the bottom die has kind of a thumbnail looking shape in it, and then there's a reverse of that shape in the top die. So when you run the panel through that, it kind of folds the metal up over that thumbnail, and then so as you run it in, it folds it up, and then as you pull it out, it kind of flattens it back out. But it's just kind of gathering the metal together and pulling it all together to shrink it. So we'll go ahead and do that, show you guys that process, and keep working to get this scoop finished up. All right, so we've got some of the thumbnail shrinking started. Did that, went over, shrink a little bit on the front edge on the actual shrinker stretcher. And then after looking at it, I decided what I wanted to do was actually trim a little bit off, because I had about 3 inches almost of excess on the front. So I wanted to get that trimmed up some. I'm still not down to where I will be, at when the end product is there. But I wanted to get some of it off because it'll help the shrinking. Obviously, the more material you have, the more you have to shrink, all that kind of stuff. So wanted to get it closer, trim some of that off, and just to be able to do a little more shrinking. So at this point, I'm going to go back over to the shrinker stretcher, do a little bit more shrinking on the front edge, and then I'll come back, probably do a little more thumbnail, and then a little more on the shrinker stretcher to kind of get that. But you can kind of see, the plane of the top of this, and then it's already starting to kind of curve over in the front, and that's what we need. So as this sits on the hood, it's going, obviously once it's set in place, come here and it'll start curving over just a little bit. So I've got a little more shrinking to do in order to get it there. So I'm going to keep doing that, shrinking just to get it a little bit closer. And then we're just about there where I can do the final smoothing on this to get it, to the nice contour that we want, where it's nice and smooth. And then at that point, it'll be ready to start doing the flange work, tipping the flange over on the outer edge here to get it to have a place to sit down on the hood. And then we'll be on to fine tune work from there. So we're gonna keep shrinking. All right, so we've gone back and forth with the shrinker, thumbnail shrinking, and then a little bit of regular shrinking around the front here just to kind of tighten it up. To show you guys what the shrinking is doing, I know at this point it just looks like it's really pretty much just messed up the metal. It's all wavy and pretty bad looking, but that's part of the process. So, you know, when I first cut this panel, it was 14.5 inches wide. So in the back it's 14.5, and now that we've shaped right here before the area that we shrank, now there's probably a little bit of stretch that went on getting these radiuses in here. So we're at just a hair under 14.75, and it started out at 14.5. So we got that little bit of stretch around the outside. Now, basically to show you guys, so I've got a Sharpie line that I can barely see right here, but this was the very front edge. This is where I'm eventually going to cut the scoop to create the opening in the edge right here. So if I measure around there, right at that Sharpie line, measure around, I'm at just, well, about 13 3/16-ish. So that started out as 14.5 inches wide. So doing the thumbnail shrinking back and forth on this, combined with this shrinking on the edge, you know, kind of working it back and forth to keep bringing that metal together, we've been able to pull pretty much about 1.5 inches almost to shrink out of this thing, because it went from, well, if you went based off of this was 14, almost 14.75, and now we're at like 13 and just under a quarter. So about 1.5 inches of shrink in this. So you know, just to, you know, show you guys that amount of shrink that it takes sometimes on this, and how much you can actually shrink something. You know, if you're not quite used to metalwork, you know, there's a lot of things that you can do with metal that a lot of times you don't think is possible. Like, well, how do you shrink metal? How do you shrink, you know, if a piece of metal is flat, how do you shrink it? It's metal, it's hard, it's all that stuff. Well, you know, there's different processes. Obviously what I've been doing here to shrink and pull some of the metal together, you know, kind of folding and pulling the metal together and all that sort of thing. So, you know, it is possible to get a lot of shrink out of it. So at this point, I'm really close to the measurement I need for the front of this, and I'm right there where I need to be for the back edge here. So at this point, what I'm going to do is English wheel this just a little bit to smooth it out. I'm not trying to really stretch it a bunch, anything like that. All I'm going to do is smooth out this surface to get it to just be smooth, have a nice contour so that it comes forward on the scoop and contours, you know, down to where we need it here. Once I get that to where I'm pretty happy with that, and everything's kind of looking like I want it there, then we're going to start tipping the flanges over and really get this thing fit to the hood. So let's get this on the English wheel and get this looking a little bit nicer. All right, hopefully you can see after that English wheeling that, you know, that we were able to get this front area more smooth, and basically it's not perfect, but we don't need it to be, because the whole goal here was just to kind of blend all this together a little bit more, let this top area take a little more shape. Once we get it a little closer to fitting everything like we need it to, at that point then we'll come through and really do the final touches on this to make it really nice and smooth and just blend everything together as it should be. So at this point I've got lines marked on the sides, kind of where I'm going to be tipping these flanges on the sides. So I'm going to spend a few minutes, get a few things trimmed up a little bit closer, just verifying that everything's kind of shaping up as I want it. And at that point then, you know, we'll mark out and measure, make sure everything's, you know, exactly how we kind of need it to fit height-wise before we tip the flanges over. And then we'll get the flanges tipped, and then we'll do any kind of last minute, you know, final smoothing and finishing of the panel as we fit it to the hood with the flanges on it. started using the bead roller to tip these flanges over. Obviously there's a ways to go, and when we're tipping these, I have to do some shrinking and stretching in order to keep the flanges in the shape that we need them to be, and the angles that we need them to be. And what I mean by that is if you look at this, it kind of has a bow front to back, but I need that bow up here to taper forward towards the nose of the scoop. But through this area, I actually need it from this plane to be fairly straight. And it does have a little bit of a bow to it. So I'm actually gonna keep working this, doing a little bit of shrinking, because shrinking this flange will actually pull it in this way as I shrink it. So I need to keep shrinking it to get it to pull in, and that will also, as it pulls it in, because of the curve, it's gonna push the panel down this way, which will in turn flatten it out this way. So gonna keep tipping, gonna keep shrinking the flange, stretching where I need to, that sort of thing, to get it all to lay to where when we put it on the hood, it will lay nice and flat on there. So we'll keep working. All right, guys, so we've worked back and forth between the bead roller and the JS shrinker to be able to tip this flange over. So we've got it pretty much to where the flange is sitting pretty nicely on the hood. It's not 100% perfect at this point, but we've got it to where this thing sits down and it's the heights that we need it to be. Now, like I said before, there's a lot of excess here on the front because I'm going to end up tipping an edge over just a little bit to create a nice lip on the front opening of the scoop here in the front. So, got the rest of this shaped up. Overall, I'm pretty happy with it. It fits, pretty well, compared to the vision I was having. So, really, this is a pretty complex part to go from, all of this kind of taper, curve here to being kind of more flat across the middle and then fading off into pretty much nothing at the back. It's a pretty complex part. So, really pretty happy with how it's come together here. Going to be doing a tiny bit more work on the flanges to get everything to sit down 100%. But what I'm going to do right now, before I do that, is basically I'm going to mark out a line on this flange, because with the shrinking and stretching and with the way the panel was originally, the flange width kind of varies front to back. It kind of goes in and out and whatever. So at this point, and I did that on purpose, I left the excess on there a little bit so I could at that point trim the flange down. So I'm going to get that all marked out, trim the flange to where it's nice and even front to back, and then once it's at that point, I'll make sure it's sitting on there well, and then we'll start clecoing this thing in place. Once I get it to where it sits down, it's clecoed in place everywhere, the last thing I'll do is come in and trim this front edge, do any kind of fine smoothing anywhere that needs it, that sort of thing. I'll tip this flange over, and then we'll metal finish the whole surface and get it looking real nice before we rivet it onto the hood. So this would be, pretty close to the finished product. So at this point, it's just the fine-tuned finish work of it. So let's get this thing wrapped up. All right, so the last thing you guys saw me do there was tip this edge over on the front, and I actually did that with the shrinker stretcher. So I just, as I was putting some shrinking pressure on it, I was kind of forcing the panel down and over to tip that edge, and I just kept shrinking it because as this flange bent over, it needed to shrink to keep that curve in the front. So got the sides trimmed up, and now as you can see, it fits pretty nicely on the hood. So little fine-tuned tweaking to get it to be on there, and we're going to start clecoing it in place. All right, so you saw me drill all the holes, get them laid out, and drill the holes for the rivets to be able to transfer them onto the hood. So got those drilled out, got the flanges cleaned up, and I did put a couple of clecos in the hood to get it set in place. And then what I did is I took the hood back over to the truck, and we fitted on the truck to verify that everything fit, we're good, everything's gonna clear. So yeah, at this point, just gonna put a couple of clamps on this to make sure everything's held nice and steady. We'll drill the rest of the holes in the flanges, or actually through the hood, through the flanges, and then we'll be ready to start the metal finishing process to be able to get this final riveted to the hood. So I'm gonna get this going, and we'll get this finished up here. All right, so we got all the clecos in place. As you can see, I've got some gaps here between some clecos and in the back as well, and that is because that is where there is inner structure under the hood skin that would make it pretty difficult to be able to buck a rivet on the back side. So because of that, we're just going to leave that space open. The type of rivets we're going to be using are going to be flush fit solid rivets. So I actually have to countersink the holes that we've drilled just a little bit so that the head of the rivet will sit flush. It's kind of like a flathead bolt where it's tapered on the bottom side, flat on the top. So like I said, we'll countersink that with a little countersink bit, and then get it to where each one of those rivets will sit flush, and then we can pop them in place and buck them. And then in the flanges, when you feel them, will have that nice smooth feel to them, so you won't have a rivet head sticking up on the outside. So at this point, now that we have all the clecos in here, everything's in place and looking good. The last things we're going to do is there's some edges and some corners that I'm just going to trim and round off just a little bit, just to finish those off real nicely. And you know, so we'll get those finished up that way. We'll make sure that all the edges are nice and straight, everything looks really good. And then we'll clean up the outside surface of this to give it a nice brushed look. So you know, I'm going to sand it up. Then we'll use Scotch-Brite, sanding block, that sort of thing to create a nice brushed look in the scoop front to back. So I'll be sanding long ways this direction to create those lines in it with a brushed look, and you know, just create a look, because they're actually not going to paint the scoop. So they're going to paint the rest of the hood, get it all dialed in, painted the same blue color, and they're going to leave the scoop aluminum. So we're going to get it brushed out so that they can get this thing completed, and they'll be hitting the racetrack, I believe, sometime in the next 2 weeks. So we'll get some pictures of it as a completed project on their ride and out on the salt flats, hopefully. So yeah, we'll keep going on this thing and get it wrapped up. All right, guys, so we got this all metal finished out. You saw there, DA sanded it all down. You know, got everything smoothed up how we wanted it to be, and then we rubbed it down. I just sprayed some WD-40 on here when I was doing the Scotch-Brite on here. I like to do that because it kind of creates a little lubrication between the two surfaces, and especially with aluminum, it's so soft. It just helps the Scotch-Brite glide on the surface and do the brushing work without you know, really gouging into the surface too hard. So it just provides that extra, like I said, kind of lubrication for the surface, and I think the finish actually comes out nicer doing it that way. So did it with a red medium coarseness Scotch-Brite hand pad, and then a gray one, which is a kind of a fine coarseness. So did that, you know, got everything all dialed in, radiuses on all the corners of the flanges, that sort of thing. You know, got everything prepped up, and so at this point we are now ready to rivet on the scoop here. So like I said, I'm using flush fit rivets. So I already went through with a taper countersink bit and countersunk the holes here. So now the rivets will slide in, and they'll fit nice and flush once we hammer them in place. So we'll be hammering with an air hammer for an air riveter hammer. This has a flat die on it, and it has a little rubber O-ring or grommet around there, and that kind of keeps it from you know, gouging any edges, or if it does kind of vibrate a little bit to the side, you know, I won't hit like the side of the scoop or anything like that with, you know, metal on metal. It'll hit the rubber first. So just helps make a nice finished product on there. So we'll be using the air riveter. This is a I believe it's a 3X. Yeah, so it's a 3X hammer, and we'll be using a bucking bar as well. So we're gonna get to riveting on this and get this thing finished up. All right, well, we've got it all riveted on here, and you know, it's all flush fit rivets, so it's got that nice smooth look on the flanges, and you know, hopefully it'll be a little more streamlined for them out on the salt flats. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this project. Hopefully that you know, it gives you some things that you can take home to your shop, some things, some tips and ideas, and you know, ways that you can use certain tools. I used a lot of different tools on this. You know, everything from, you know, your hand tools like tin snips and such, to English wheel, bead roller, planching hammer, mini max, shrinker stretcher, that sort of thing. So, you know, this is a pretty complex shape on this scoop, but you know, projects of this type are still possible, even with more basic tools. But obviously, some of the, you know, bigger machines and things make it a lot nicer, a lot easier to work, you know, on a piece like this. So really hope you enjoyed this video on building this scoop, and we'll show you guys some pictures of it on the truck, and it's time to get this thing off to paint so they can head out to the salt flats.